after a week of talking very small picture, hyper specific, this transfer is coming in, these recruits have committed to Pitt. What does it all mean? How many games are they going to win in 2024? Should you bet the over or the under? Very hyper specific things to Pitt. Topics that are very directly related to Pitt and sort of just very specific. I thought we could look at the bigger picture today because we're getting a more and more clear idea of what the future of college sports, at least the near future of college sports, is going to look like. You're seeing reports coming out. Russ Dellinger, I think, had one of the latest ones yesterday in Yahoo Sports of a potential settlement in a number of antitrust cases that are have been taken against the NCAA, settlements that could be coming that could change really how everything looks. And we all know that college sports are going to look very, very different a couple of years from now, but we're getting a clear idea of what that's going to look like. So now we take that bigger picture and we apply it back to the small picture, the hyper specific. What does it mean for Pitt? If this settlement goes through, if things all move in a certain direction that they seem to be moving with a revenue sharing cap, and roster expansions and back damages and all these different things that are going to ultimately cost universities and athletic departments money, what does it mean for Pitt? What does it look like for Pitt? Is it good for Pitt? Or is this another, concerning development in the progress of college sports? Progress meaning steps into the future, not necessarily steps forward or backward. That's all. That's a little bit more subjective, but we all know it's changing. That's objective. There's no debate about that. What we can discuss, though, is what it means for Pitt and what it looks like for Pitt. So let's talk about that. The big picture applied to the little picture, what it means for Pitt and the changes in college sports going forward. Here on the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's Thursday. It's the Morning Pitt. It's youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com, hanging out with you this morning for a little bit of Pitt sports talk. I say this morning because that's when the video gets released, but you might be watching it in the afternoon. You might be watching it in the evening. Whenever you're watching it, and I hope you're watching the video. If you're just listening to the podcast, the audio podcast, I appreciate that. I'm glad that you like the sound of my voice, but the reality is it would be much cooler if you just watched the video on YouTube. Even if you just put it on and listen to it, that's fine, but it's the whole thing with revenue streams and whatnot, and you might notice there are no ads during the audio podcast. I don't know if you ever noticed that or picked up on that, but other than me doing a little promo for the site, there's not a lot in the way of advertising on the podcast, and you could probably draw connections about what that means about revenue, but I digress. Do me a favor, like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. The subscribe button is right down there. Click that button and you can never miss anything that we do here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Whether it's these daily Morning Pitt videos that we do every day of the week, the weekly live show that we do every Wednesday night. We did last night with Jim Hammett talking a little bit of Pitt sports, some of these very same topics. Or we have press conferences, interviews, all kinds of things. And it's all right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So like and subscribe so you don't miss any of it. And of course, check out the website Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com for all your Pitt sports news and community message boards where people are talking about these kinds of things all day, every day. So if you haven't been following the news, and I assume most of you have, but if you haven't, there's 3 major cases being taken up against the NCAA right now. Forgetting it's House, Hubbard, and Carter. That's it. 3 antitrust cases, all really, with one goal. The goal being to get the NCAA to pay back damages to student athletes who played since their various back dates on these cases. But the idea is guys and gals who played college sports, NCAA Division I sports, and maybe beyond. I'm not even sure what the scope is. Over a certain period of time, who feel like, hey, you changed the rules, and all these kids now are getting NIL. We should have gotten NIL. And so you're going to owe us like $20 billion in back damages. And everyone reading the tea leaves says the NCAA is not going to win these cases. It says the NCAA is going to end up having to pay this money, and it is going to be crushing, potentially bankruptcy-inducing for the NCAA if these cases go to trial and they ultimately end up in judgment. it's not expected to go the NCAA's way. It's expected to be pretty bad for the NCAA. And so the big movement now and the anticipation is that there will be a settlement. And that settlement is likely to go a long way in determining what the near future of college sports looks like. As part of the settlement, yes, people who played before NIL are going to get some money, and it's going to come out of everyone's pockets. Most of the schools are going to be out like $1 or $2 million a year, which is a small amount. I mean, it's not a small amount. If you gave me that amount, it would be great. Taking it out of a university athletic department budget, small amount. And compared to some of the other things that they will be paying or could be paying, it's a small amount. But there are other elements to the judgment as well, or to the proposed settlement as well, namely a revenue sharing system that gets set up where some of the money is shared with the student athletes. There'll be a cap on it. I think it's like 21% of the average power conference revenue. Roughly, I think in 2025 it would work out to about $21 million, $22 million that would be shared with the student athletes. And there's different sort of stipulations and caveats and things like that. If NIL money comes into play and this kind of thing and that kind of thing. But it's more or less that's at the crux of it. I want to find. I have the article like open just because I want to keep an eye on. I just want to make sure I get all the details and the data and that kind of thing. The other part of it too, there's sort of three main prongs of this potential settlement that's been reported. Ross Dellinger and others, a revenue sharing system with a cap, paying the back damages. Probably $1 or $2 million per year per school for about 10 years, and then an expansion of scholarships or really removal of scholarship limits, but a shrinking of roster sizes. And I've seen different numbers thrown around. It's relevant for football where they're talking about maybe having the roster size capped at like 90, but unlimited scholarships. So you're having fewer players on the team because the cap now is like 110 or 120 or something. So you'd have fewer players on the team, but all of them will be on scholarship, whereas right now you're limited at 85. It wouldn't be a huge increase, though, for football. You'd only be looking, I think, at adding 5, maybe on the high end 10 scholarship players, where it gets really interesting, and this is going to be something that just sort of gets brushed aside, but we'll bring it up every now and then because it's relevant, is some of the sports that do the equivalency scholarships where you get half of a scholarship, but 3/4 of a scholarship. You change those limits or remove those limits, make them full scholarship sports, like something like baseball, and then have no limits on the scholarships, just have a limited roster size, 35 or 40 kids. Then I think you're going to see there's already a separation in college baseball of the haves and the have-nots, and it might be even more stark than it is in college football. It might be even more regional than it is in college football. But I think it will go to extremes where the schools that are truly baseball crazy will fill their rosters with full scholarship players because they make revenue that can come close to justifying it. A school like Pitt is not going to make that revenue and it's not going to experience that level of success. And you're going to start questioning whether or not you can really compete at all. And it's already difficult for a school in the North to compete in college baseball. But the reality is, and we'll probably come back to this a number of times today and going forward as we have these conversations, I mean, there are going to be big questions about a lot of the sports that are not football or men's basketball. Some schools are able to generate net revenue out of sports beyond those two, but largely it comes down to those two. And if you're not one of those schools where the other sports, the non-football men's basketball sports, if you're not one of those schools where those other sports are generating revenue and contributing financially to the athletic department, they're going to end up being big questions. Because if you take all of this together, and the estimate in Ross Dellinger's article is, you say you have about $21 million in this revenue sharing, right? So that's money going out of the athletic department budget, going to the student athletes. And then you have the $1 or $2 million going in the back damages to the settlement from the case, right, to the former players, and that's something that the NCAA would pay out, but all the schools would contribute to it. I think the figure I saw thrown around was about 60% would come from the schools, the other 40% would come from the NCAA itself. But there's another $1 or $2 million coming out of the athletic department budget, and then the money for extra scholarships that you're going to have to throw in. Dellinger estimates it at like $10 million. You're looking at $30 million plus per year coming out of the athletic department budget over the course of 10 years. You're looking at $300 million that the athletic department will not have. And we dovetail with Pitt now because there's a giant hole next to the Peterson Event Center that's costing, $300 and some million. Pitt is going to face some very interesting crossroads in the very near future, particularly under this. They would face it no matter what, and particularly under this kind of system, they would face it in a big way. Because now you're taking those giant chunks out of the athletic department budget, which I think Pitt operates on a rather thin margin to begin with the bulk of the revenue and positive intake coming from football and men's basketball, while also taking up a significant portion of the budget themselves. That's where the money comes from, most of it. And then you're taking this big chunk. Let's say they don't even go so far as to spend $10 million in extra scholarships. You're still looking at $20 to $25 million coming out of the budget that, wasn't coming out last year. And if this goes into place for 2025, that money wasn't coming out of the budget for, 23-24 or 24-25. That money was in there. That's a, $25 million that you're now going to have, you are not going to be able to count on. And this puts Pitt in a very interesting situation because for all of these schools where they're going to have to pay this money and take this money out of their budgets, you got to find where it comes from. And I'm not sure where Pitt's extra $22 or $24 million is going to come from, or $25 million. Let's just call it 25. Let's just use that shorthand to understand it. I don't know where Pitt's $25 million is going to come from. I don't. Which brings me to perhaps the most important element of all of this for Pitt. Okay? Because as we talk about, is this good for Pitt? Is this bad for Pitt? How's Pitt going to survive this? How's Pitt going to handle this? How are they going to approach it and thrive in this kind of environment? The most important thing is that whatever happens, whatever this looks like in 5 years, Pitt has to have a seat at the table. Whatever table that is, it's got to be at the biggest table. And right now, the biggest table is the 4 power conferences, right? The Big 12, the ACC, the Big 10, and the SEC. And I did that in backwards order. And maybe, ACC, Big 12, there's probably some debate there. Pitt has to find a way to keep itself in that arena. You cannot afford to drop out. You cannot afford to not be getting the biggest media rights deal possible. And I mean, the ACC right now is not getting the biggest media rights deal possible, but I'm of the opinion, I think most people are, that in 5 years, the conferences are going to look very different. And the concept of what a college football conference and college basketball conference is going to be very, very different. Or maybe not even basketball. I mean, I think maybe just football, you'll have sort of football-only alignments. And if that comes to pass, if everything more or less stays the same on the basketball side, but you have these football alignments or realignments or whatever they end up being, Pitt needs to be at the biggest one. And that doesn't mean they need to get into the Big Ten. It doesn't mean they need to get into the SEC. What it does mean is whatever those two conferences decide to do, however they decide to mold the future of college athletics, Pitt has to be part of it. Because if you're not, if you fall by the wayside, if you don't have a seat at the big table, it's going to be very tough to meet these budgetary allotments, let's call it. Now, let's say the whole thing with the ACC falls apart and Pitt and the remaining schools in the conference get a buttload of cash from, or a boatload, I think. I mean, let's try and be formal here. We're a gentleman's podcast, a gentleman's video on YouTube. A boatload of cash from Clemson and Florida State and, Miami or North Carolina, whoever else goes, right? And so they split that up. Well, that's going to float you through a few years of this setup. you need to be getting yourself into whatever the biggest table is. You need to be there. Because if you cut off that revenue stream, you're relegated. You're relegated. And this goes for anybody in the ACC. And this goes for anybody in the Big 12. And quite frankly, and who was it? Somebody, was it Iowa State basketball? No, I forget who brought it up. But even if you're at the bottom, if you're one of the schools at the bottom of the SEC and the Big Ten, if you're Rutgers or you're Vanderbilt, right, you got to be a little concerned. You have to be, because at some point, they're gonna the ones at the top are gonna say, "Why are we carrying you?" You know, if you're Vanderbilt, you're gonna sit back and you're gonna say, you know, some turn of that old, you know, when they came for Texas A&M, you know, or when they came for the Big 12, I said nothing because it didn't affect me or something. And when they came for the, you know, the ACC and the Pac-12, I said nothing because it didn't affect me. And you know, and when they came for me, there was no one left to speak for me or something. Like, you have to be watching your back if you're Vanderbilt. You have to be watching your back if you're Rutgers. If you're one of these schools that doesn't really carry nearly as much weight or do as much heavy lifting as the other school, as the schools at the top of the SEC and Big Ten, you could find yourself in trouble real quick. Okay, so the goal for all of those schools, for the remaining Pac-12 teams, for the Big 12 right now, the ACC, in case they lose some of those, and even those schools at the bottom of the SEC and the Big 10, they need to be focused on how they're going to make themselves just an essential piece. No, we can't do this without Pitt. Can't do this without Rutgers. Can't do this without Minnesota. Can't do this without, no, Minnesota's not a good example. Can't do this without Vanderbilt. You know, can't do this without West Virginia. Can't do this without Oklahoma State. You need to make yourself part of it. And this is something that you needed to have already started doing. Like, Pitt needs to have been prepared for this, to make itself as presentable and as attractive as possible, so that when those, you know, whatever the new alignment looks like in a couple years, they're part of it, because they're going to need that media money to come in so they can operate in this, you know, post-settlement, you know, world. Now, I do think there's some upsides to it if you end up in a revenue sharing system. One of the parts of the settlement seems like it could be, and seems like it should be, kind of a renewed emphasis on getting rid of, or on policing pay-to-play use of NIL. By which I mean we all know what it is right now. But maybe if you get these student athletes into a revenue sharing system, then you can really kind of crack down on the NIL payments that aren't really any actual, like, quid pro quo. You know what I mean? Like, what are you really doing to get that $350,000? You know, like, okay, if you're doing car ads and stuff like that, all right, that's one thing. But if you're just getting a check to make a couple appearances, you know, cracking down on that, making sure it's all actually on the level. And then a part of that is rolling the whole apparatus and operation into the athletic department, so there's better record keeping and more transparency. I think there are ways to actually get NIL into something of a respectable, honorable system. You know, if you get into this revenue sharing, process, I think you can actually do that. And so there might be some quote unquote improvement in that regard. And then eventually you get to a step where maybe you can get into almost contracts. I know the NCAA and the schools don't want to go down the road of employees, but that might be the best way to start curbing some of the annual player movement and get guys a little bit committed to their schools for a longer period of time. But look, it's very much a period of upheaval. It's very much a period of, you know, anything can happen. Nobody knows what's going to happen. These settlements, though, this is an earth-shattering move. And really the Alston case that sort of led to NIL was the first sort of earth-shattering move. These three here, House and Hubbard and Carter, are the next major step. And if you're Pitt, you got to be prepared for it. You got to really think about how you're spending your money, what's a smart way to spend your money. And I wouldn't suggest that you start looking for ways out of the Victory Heights project, because, like I say, you got a giant hole right next to the Peterson Event Center. That's a whole lot of money being spent there. And right now, you're entering an era where you're going to need a lot of money in order to maintain your most profitable athletic programs. Pitt's coming up to a crossroads, an important one. And it's going to be a test of the leadership, the university level and at the athletic department level. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not going to sit here and say I can predict what's going to happen, but I can predict that it's a crossroads. And I can predict that it's going to be a test of leadership. We'll see. It's going to be really interesting to watch. Really interesting to watch. All right. Thanks for tuning in today. Really appreciate it. Like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Even if you're listening on the podcast, if you listen to the audio podcast, you owe it to me to go over to YouTube and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We appreciate that. Check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Thanks for watching this video. Thanks for watching all week. We'll be back with the Friday morning bag tomorrow. Can't wait. We'll end the week on a high note here on the Morning Pit. youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.